Thank you all for coming today to our National Disaster Preparedness Expo for the city of Newport Beach. My name is Natalie Basmudjian. I'm your Library Services Manager. This program is brought to you by generous funding from our Friends of the Library bookstore. If you have seen them in the lobby, thank you very much. They have supported us in bringing Dr. Jones here to speak to all of you today. We have representatives from our Community Emergency Resource Team here. They're all identified in their green vests. They do a tremendous job preparing and educating the community. I'm proud that my dad is a member. He started just a few months ago. After Dr. Jones' presentation, you may get a book purchased from Lido Village Books. Dr. Jones will sign the book, and then you may go to the courtyard and speak with the CERT volunteers about disaster preparedness. We also have a company called Be Ready, which is a local Orange County company, and they are promoting their survival kits and their resources for the community. Let's get to our guest. Dr. Lucy Jones is a world-renowned seismologist with over 30 years experience in studying earthquakes and other natural disasters. Dr. Jones' new book is called The Big Ones, and she will be speaking about the impact of disasters on our lives. Please welcome Dr. Lucy Jones.
Thank you all. Good committed group here. This is wonderful. I'm going to take you today through some stories of natural disasters. Perhaps you don't think that dwelling on catastrophes is a really fun thing to do. I actually find it pretty fascinating. But I think that if we look at what the worst natural disasters have been, it can help us understand how to be better ready for what's in our future. But I'm going to do it as a scientist, because I am a scientist, and start from the first principles, which is actually that natural hazards are natural processes. They are part of what make the world livable. Right? If we didn't have faults here in Southern California, we wouldn't have the mountains that have trapped the clouds that allow us to have rain and mean that we're not a desert. And of course, the city of Los Angeles began because of the discovery of oil, which was trapped along the faults. So we need to remember that they are a natural part of the world, and we've got to figure out how to live with them. Just because something hasn't happened in our lifetime means that it's who could have known? It seems like after every disaster, somebody's saying, who could have known it would be like this? And I go, well, we were trying to tell you this. So, I mean, to be able to have a river that brings us the water for our crops, that gives us a place to play, sometimes it's going to look like this, right? Flooding is an inevitable part along any river. But it's not just that. San Francisco Bay is there because the San Andreas fault system has split into the San Andreas and Hayward fault, and the bay is there in between those two big faults. And even with the volcanoes, you might think, boy, that's something that we could be avoiding. On the other hand, the slopes of volcanoes are some of the most fertile cropland in the world. So it is part of the natural world, and it's our job to figure out how to live with it. Now, what do we need to live with? What is going on? In the end, it's all about heat. Okay, so in the water systems, the reason we have our storms, the reason we have our floods, is fundamentally being driven by heat, evaporating the water, bringing it over to the mountains, raining, bringing it back down. You've got a heat cycle. That's pretty obvious in the meteorologic hazards. The geologic hazards, it's all about heat too, just on a longer time scale. Okay, so you've got the center of the earth heating up because it's compressed and there are radioactive materials in there, and that hot center wants to cool off, and you get convection cells, just like when you pour cream into coffee and things need to mix up. It just happens on a much slower time scale. So in the end, we have the hot core of the earth pushing up lava at our mid-ocean ridges, which create new rock plates that move out and eventually get pushed back down into the earth along our subduction zones. And when that rock is either moving sideways here or pushing down in here, There's friction that holds it in place and gives us our earthquakes and actually many of our volcanoes. But a fundamental about this is we pretty well know where disasters are going to happen. We would say that they are spatially predictable, right? Here's a basic plate tectonic map. We basically know where those plates are moving past each other, and we have our concentration of earthquakes. You can have them elsewhere, but we're pretty much much more strongly distributed where those boundaries are happening. People often like to talk about the Ring of Fire. I will point out that doesn't mean anything. It is a literary term. I realize we're in a library, but let's keep it in its place. And the reason we have a ring of earthquakes and volcanoes around the Pacific Ocean is because you happen to be having the boundaries of quite a few different plates. And you hear people go, but there was an earthquake in Chile and one in Japan. That means the Ring of Fire is going, and oh my God, we got to worry in California. Notice that an earthquake in Chile is between the South American and Nazca plate. An earthquake in Japan is going to be between the Pacific Ocean and the Asian plate, or maybe even the Philippine plate. And so they don't actually have any connection at all. And even if they did, we don't see transmittal of stress around the Ring of Fire. The one thing we can see is that where one earthquake happens, it makes other earthquakes more likely right there. Mostly they're smaller, and we call them aftershocks. 5% of the time, the aftershock gets bigger than the main shock, and we change the name and call the first one a foreshock. But the whole thing also dies off with distance, and you just don't see anything more than a few fault lengths away. So if it's on a 100-mile-long fault, you'll see extra earthquakes for a couple 100 miles. If it's a 1,000-mile-long fault, you'll see it for a couple 1,000 miles. If it's a 1-mile-long fault, like a magnitude 5, you see it for about 2 to 3 miles. No, a magnitude 5 in California cannot set off an earthquake in Japan. I can't believe how often I have to say that. But we do basically know where they are happening. What we don't know is when. We do have this aftershock pattern. It's the one predictable part of the distribution. But beyond that, it is essentially random. Right? Now you might think, say, let's look at the San Andreas Fault. How many of you have heard, well, it averages 100, 150 years between earthquakes. It's been 300. We must have it right now, right? Well, let's look at what the actual data looks like from one location on the San Andreas Fault. This is a place where the average time between events is only about 100 years. From Fraser Park up near Fort Tejon, recent work by Kate Scherer, for those of you who are professionals in the room. Notice that we've had 3 events with intervals less than 50 years. And we've had an event where the interval was greater than 300 years. This looks like a Poissonian distribution. The best way mathematically of describing it is that every year has a random chance of 1% of having the big earthquake, and the time since the last event doesn't really matter. Now, it's only 11 data points. Maybe when we get 100 data points, we'll see some pattern. But right now, there's really nothing that we can work from to tell us when the next earthquake's going to be. And human beings hate that, right? We do not like randomness. And if we want to look at why we hate randomness as much as we do, we need to go back, and when I say go back, I really mean go back, into the evolution of the human mind. And we became who we were, on the savannah, out in the wilderness, where we had to compete against other predators with stronger muscles, with bigger teeth. Right? We used our brain to survive in this world, and our brain has done a wonderful job of keeping us safe. It lets us look at how the mammoth is moving and create patterns where we can remember what happened in the past and figure out what's going to happen in the future. And this ability to create patterns to theorize about risk is a deeply driven need in human beings because it has been so important for our survival. I mean, think about it when you were able to make the connection between the mushrooms you just ate and the gastrointestinal distress that you're suffering. Making that pattern was a key to survival. When you could tell that that moving grass in the distance might be hiding a hidden predator, That was an important part of our evolutionary success. So we have a deep need for it. It has been very important, but we want patterns so badly, we make them when they're not there, right? We've created patterns in the ultimate random distribution, the distribution of stars, and we have attributed meaning to this. And in fact, when you look at disasters and how they are random, not just in a given year, but over generations, that is particularly distressing. Why did this generation get hit and not the great-grandparents or not the future generation? How come it happened to us? And we need to find a pattern that explains it. We have put it in the stars. In fact, if you look at the word disaster, ill-starred. It represents, by the way, it first shows up in Shakespeare, and it represents our belief that our fate is determined by the stars, and that's why this is happening to us. Right? So in that context, I now want to go and look at some great disasters in the past. They are stories from the book, and use them to look at what this means for us as we're trying to live with catastrophic disasters. So I'm going to start by going into Italy. I guess you can barely see that little box showing up, huh? And go to Mount Vesuvius, all right? To a geologist, we look at this picture and go, holy hell, what were these people thinking? Look at that volcano and look at that city, right? But it's been a long time since there's been an eruption there. We have, dozens of generations living there without an impact. Of course, they mostly do remember the past when it was different, when Mount Vesuvius erupted in AD 79. Right? Now, in the culture at the time, these disasters happened because you got in the way of the powerful gods. The pagans saw the gods as being capricious, selfish beings, and you got hurt by getting in the way of these powerful beings that didn't care about you, which probably describes a Roman peasant's life with the non-divine overlords that they had. So it was a reasonable explanation in their environment. For them, Mount Vesuvius erupts. By the way, is there any way to turn off the lights here so that the picture could be a little clearer? As I'm trying to even see the picture, I'm not seeing it. There. What about there? Does that help? Yep, okay. All right? So this is going to happen when Venus, who of course is the goddess of love, the most beautiful of the goddesses, who is married to Vulcan, the god Smith, who is an ugly god, and so she cheats on him, and when he finds out about her cheating on him, he has a male hissy fit, and Vesuvius erupts. I mean, that is the long-term tradition of why this happened. Right? When it happened in AD 79, it began with this type of eruption, which is actually called a Plinian eruption, from the Roman Pliny, who was actually the head of the admiral of the fleet in Naples when the eruption happened. And he was also a historian, or a natural historian. He wrote the first encyclopedia. He was apparently a pretty obsessive scientist who would always get out there to try and explore what went on. So when Mount Vesuvius erupted, he can see it across the bay like that. Instead of going, boy, I better get out of here, he said, boy, I want to see more clearly what's going on. And he arranged for ships to take him over to the base of the eruption. He then also had a friend who lived nearby call for help. He goes to help them. They got into port, but the eruption was causing such huge turmoil and winds, they couldn't get back out of the port. And he actually ended up dying, overcome by the noxious gases there during the eruption. And his nephew, Pliny the Younger, wrote the story of it, described the eruption looking like this, and that's why it's called a Plinian eruption. Right? When it happened, first it all goes up like this, but the gases coming out of the mountain and all of the lava, the pumice and the volcanic ash with it, is heavy and starts to flow down. So for the first day, they're dealing with this, and they describe it as being completely dark. People were sure they were going to be dying. Pliny the Younger describes it after his uncle has gone off, he was sure that the end of the world had come, and he took a small satisfaction that the rest of the world was dying with him. In fact, that he got his mother out of the region and eventually made it back to Rome. After the first day or so of this, then as the gases got hotter, they started flowing down. This is actually a picture from Mount Pinatubo, because we didn't have cameras back in 80-79. But this shows you what happens when the gases start to flow downhill. This is called a pyroclastic flow. It's hundreds of degrees in temperature. When it hits you, you die immediately because it's heat shock. It's hundreds of degrees. And it flows at often up to 30, 40 miles an hour. They've been recorded faster than that, but they're faster than you can outrun. Jeeps can sometimes make it. They didn't have those. So in Pompeii, we of course have these famous pictures of where people were found having been encased in the ash that came down. And these contorted postures that they were in made everyone think that they were probably, horrible suffering that they had gone through as they were buried under this. In fact, we're pretty sure that it was a pyroclastic flow. They would have died instantly, and the postures are heat shock, that the cadavers would have spasmed, but people were already dead as they went in this. And they found, now I've got to remember the number, something on the order, I think it's about 2,000 corpses that were found there. But in the region, many, many more people lived there. And in fact, comparing the Roman records with the number of bodies found, they estimate that about 90% of the people got out alive. Because the first day, it's all turning black, the ash is coming down, there are rocks falling on your head. Most people left. Some people said, there are rocks falling on your head. I think we're safer inside than leaving. And of course, those would be the ones that were then caught when the pyroclastic flow came through. So here's my first lesson out of this. You're probably going to live through the disaster. Even in Pompeii, 90% make it out alive. When we look at our estimates of how many people we expect to die in a big San Andreas earthquake here in Southern California, our estimate is about 1,800 people out of a population of 20 million. 99.99% of us are living through it. So you shouldn't be thinking of getting ready for the earthquake as about how to not die. It's really about how to live afterwards. Okay. So here we have this Roman tradition that this is the gods fighting with each other. And at the same time, you have the Judeo-Christian tradition developing. And they looked at this and said, no, God's good. God's somebody you can make a covenant with. He's not just going to go and, randomly take you out because he's in a bad mood. If you die in a disaster, it must be your fault. So we have the very strong Judeo-Christian tradition. I'm thinking of Psalm 18. The earth is shaking because God's mad at you. Right? And it was a way of reconciling this disaster, the who knows why this disaster happens on this generation, with the concept that God isn't evil, God isn't capricious. And so we have a very strong tradition in the Western tradition of disasters happening as punishment from God. In fact, it was so widely accepted, you can't even find anyone talking about anything else, pretty much until an earthquake in 1755 in Portugal. So I'm now moving over to the west from Italy, out to Lisbon, where they had an earthquake in 1755 that our best guess is around magnitude 8.7. So most people don't even know that Europe can have earthquakes this size. If we look at this from a geologist point of view, you've got actually Africa's moving up towards Europe, and you've got this distributed band of earthquakes that come along as these two are running into each other. As you go offshore, this continues. We have something We have this seismic zone here off Swords, the Azores-Gibraltar seismic zone. And we think the source of the earthquake was probably this piece of fault right here. Right? And it had its biggest impact in Lisbon. Lisbon, before the earthquake, was the fourth largest city of Europe. If you think about it, the Portuguese had a wide empire. They were one of the really significant imperial powers. Lisbon was incredibly wealthy, with especially the diamonds coming in from Brazil. So they were living, they had their colonial wealth and a powerful country. It was an absolute monarchy, and it only recently they had gotten entwined with Spain and then re-separated, so they had their own king with absolute powers. But they were also a very heavily Catholic country and very tied up in the Inquisition. At the time of the earthquake, the Inquisition had been going on for many decades. People were regularly burned at the stake. It was a very devoutly Catholic country with almost 200,000 of their 3 million citizens in convents or monasteries. So there were very, very few Protestants, and if you were a Protestant in Lisbon, you might end up here. So it also was tending to really restrict the intellectual development because it was a pretty constrained thing. At the time of the earthquake, there was the prime minister of the country was Sebastiano de Carvalho. And de Carvalho had risen to power. He was pretty much running the country because the king really didn't want to be bothered. When the earthquake happened, it happened on All Saints' Day. Now, this would be a day when every Catholic has to go to church. The king and his family actually went to the early services so they could go out to their country estate and go celebrate the holiday. At 9:30 or 9:40 in the morning when this earthquake happened, most of the nobility was in church. The servants go earlier to be able to create the feast. Every church in the city is packed, and every church in the city came down. Right, because they were all built out of stone. They were preferentially along the riverbank where you would have soft soil. And so everybody in church, many of the people in the church did indeed die. Here is a time when something much larger percentage of the population, probably 20 to 30% of the population of Lisbon, it's very difficult to get to get accurate totals out of all of this. But one of the problems is, and then they had a tsunami that came up the river and came into the city. Also, during the church services, all of the candles are lit, and they're all knocked over, and the fires get started, and the city burned down. Right? And one of the theological challenges that this posed, you have all of the people dying in the churches. The brothels basically did okay. They are up on the hillside in wood frame buildings. So it was a pretty significant theological challenge to people to try and understand what's going on here. As I mentioned, Sebastiano de Carvalho ended up becoming the Marquês de Pombal. He was the prime minister. He responded incredibly effectively. He went first out to where the king was in this country estate. He was apparently completely shaken up, and de Carvalho comes in the room and, "What do we do?" And "Sire, we bury the dead and we feed the living," which to me is one of the most succinct statements of emergency management I've ever heard. And he went out and proceeded to do that. He was writing decrees on his lap in pencil to get them out quickly enough. He apparently lived in his carriage for the next week, riding around the city, getting all of these things organized. I've actually heard emergency managers like, how do we keep people in place? Well, the Marquês de Pombal actually closed all of the city gates and ordered everybody to stay in place to be able to help rebuild. He ordered that all of the dead be weighted down and thrown to sea, even though the Jesuits opposed it because they had to get them out before they started rotting. So he responded incredibly effectively, and within a month, he had proposed to the king a series of options for how to rebuild the city. And they ended up choosing the most aggressive option. They got a lot of financial support from England, actually, and they rebuilt the city. And it was rebuilt in a style that's actually called Pombaline because he tested the buildings. He made scale models of the buildings, set them up, and had the military canter their horses around the scale buildings. It's our first earthquake engineering testing, creating vibrations by running the horses around. And they completely redid the city, so you see the big passages, the big streets now to help reduce the fire passages, and rebuilt the city. And he was so successful that within the next 4 years, he was able to get the Jesuits completely thrown out of Portugal, which he wanted to do because he felt that they were really inhibiting the development of the country. But one of the lessons here now is that understanding that recovery is as important as response. You need to go in and at that moment, and how you handle response is going to affect your ability to recover. But what really matters is what sort of life do you have after the event. Back to that theological issue. It actually led to a huge philosophical debate across Europe. Voltaire wrote the poem on the Lisbon disaster, actually was published only 1 month after the event, where he really attacked this idea, can you then impute a sinful deed to babes who on their mother's bosoms bleed? Just how awful it was to say that this was somebody's fault in doing that. But it caused a huge debate. This was such a fundamental part of Western society. Rousseau, for one, argued back. He said this is clearly the sin of having chosen to live in cities. He was really into naturalism and the evils of the urban life. And he argued that this was the mistake of trying to stay in cities, and that besides, we didn't know what worse fate these people would have suffered if they had lived through it. Maybe this was God being merciful. And you really got to wonder what he thought about cities, that this is the lesser fate than continuing to live there. But out across Europe, you saw the philosophers arguing against God in this role at all. And it was so unprecedented. Voltaire was often called an atheist, even though in fact he was a theist, but by rejecting this aspect of God, that God would have caused the disasters, he's rejecting God completely. Among the Catholics, you saw a feeling that they clearly had not been fervent enough in their protection of the true faith. There were 40 executions of Protestants in the month after the earthquake. But then if you were a Protestant, what more proof do you need that the Inquisition was the work of the devil? And in fact, the Calvinists at The Hague, their ambassador asked for aid for Portugal. And the response from The Hague in the Netherlands was, God has decreed how much Lisbon should suffer, and it is not our place to interfere with God has decreed. So we began a path away from believing in divine retributions, but it's taken us a long time to move away from that, and there's still a pretty good chunk of people who still want to believe that this is true. This is not solely a Western problem. We have our individual relationship with God, but in Asia, you also have a belief that it can't possibly be random. And to look at that, I'm going to move over to Japan and look at the Kanto earthquake that happened in 1923. This was a magnitude 7.9 earthquake that happened under Tokyo. So one thing when you think about an earthquake, after 80 years of Caltech telling you that earthquakes happen at epicenters, a lot of you think it's true, but it's not. Earthquakes begin at epicenters, but they happen over a surface. You have to have one side moving with respect to the other, and the size of that surface determines the magnitude. So think about snapping your fingers. When you snap your fingers, you have two surfaces in frictional contact. If you don't push together, you slide past without any noise. Because of what you push together and you have enough friction, you slip suddenly, release energy in the form of a sound wave. So the earthquake is happening over a fault that's like my fingers, and the waves that you feel are like the sound wave that's coming off of my fingers here. We can now have a wave that travels through the earth, shaking the earth rather than just the air. Right? And a couple of things. You can't snap your fingers at a point. You need a surface. And the bigger the surface, the bigger the earthquake. The other thing is that it dies off pretty quickly from the surface. So you don't have to be very far away from the earthquake to have much less shaking. The flip side is when you're right on top of the fault, it really is a lot worse. So in 1923, we put a fault, it was about 140 kilometers, almost 100 miles across, and about 60 miles wide. On Tokyo, the center of Tokyo's here, the center of Yokohama's here. We had basically 4 million people living right on top of the earthquake. And the result was devastating. Much of the city was shaken down. Much of the city had grown very recently, because it was only in the last 50 years before this earthquake that they were seeing a lot of urbanization. And then fires got going. And the fires, because the earthquake happened right at lunch hours, people were all cooking their meals. The flames got knocked over. We're seeing a theme here with big earthquakes in big cities, by the way. Make sure you have a fire extinguisher at home. So the fires spread. They developed what are called dragon twists. That's what the Japanese call them, fire tornadoes. We saw them up in Northern California just this summer. So these fire tornadoes were sweeping through Tokyo. There was one open area where they think about 40,000 people had escaped to, and the fire tornado came through it and killed all but 2,000 of those people. One of those 2,000 said, if this were not hell, where would hell be? Right? So here is an earthquake that isn't just a bad earthquake. This is destroying your capital city. Again, luckily the imperial family was not in residence when the earthquake happened. They were not affected. But in the Asian tradition, you don't have a personal relationship with God punishing you for your sins. What you have is the whole idea of balance. That everything needs to be in balance, and that the emperor sits at the interface between the celestial and the natural realm, and if the emperor's court is out of balance, you are going to see it reflected in imbalance in the earth. So it's the balance of yin and yang. Yin is dark in its earth, in its female. Yang is male and the sky and light. So if you have too much yang, the sky is too powerful, and you get hurricanes. If the yin is too strong, it's now the earth that's become dominant, and the earth overpowers the sky, and you have earthquakes. So there's actually a treatise from ancient China, it's about 150 BC, that worked out all the reasons you would get different natural disasters and came up with guidance for the emperor of what to do to rectify the imbalance that they had created that caused this. And in the late 1860s, just after Admiral Perry had forced his way into Japan, there was an earthquake also in this general area, and it eventually led to the downfalls of the shoguns. And that in that process, there was a lot of public uprising about clearly the government problems had caused these earthquakes. So in 1923, when this earthquake comes along that's way more devastating than in 1855, where is the imbalance? And yet, it's 1923. They were developing modern seismology. They were developing modern, industrialization. So you had rather significant conflict within the society between the traditional view and the more modern approach to it. One of the reasons that the old view got traction is because there was an obvious problem with the yang in the government. The emperor had cerebral meningitis as a child, developed neurological problems, and by this point had not been seen in public for 4 years, and his son had been named the Prince Regent. So the emperor was clearly already extremely weak. In Japanese society, the prime minister also given the shogun tradition, had a lot of that role. And the prime minister had died of natural causes a week before the event. And there was no prime minister at the moment it happened. They were still trying to form a new government. So you have a situation in which all of the traditional causes of an earthquake are in high relief, and the most devastating earthquake they basically ever faced, because the first time they had a big urban city to take this. What ended up resulting, and when I could spend this whole rest of the talk trying to explore all the reasons that it ended up here, what happened is the Japanese ended up turning on the outsider. And there were about 20,000 Koreans living in the region at that time. At this point, they were a colony of Japan. And 6,000 Koreans were slaughtered by their neighbors in the next 4 days, including, they were rounded up by the police for apprehension and protection, but there were a lot of rumors that there was an uprising, they were coming to attack Tokyo, and the slaughter was such as to really come off as like ritual sacrifice. I mean, there was clearly a lot of torture that had gone on. It was one of the more difficult things to research as I looked through the history of various disasters. And it leads me to one more lesson. This may have been one of the worst expressions of it, but our most constant response to disaster is blame. If we can't say the gods did this to us, we got to find somebody else to blame, because we really can't accept that it's just random. And as awful as this seems, it's far from the only time that a response to disasters has been to turn on other people. And one of the more difficult examples of this actually comes from the United States and the 1927 Mississippi floods. I don't know how many of you have heard about these floods. Of course, the Mississippi drains more than half of the United States. In 1926, in October of 26, it started to rain, and it basically didn't stop. And as you look through the various parts of the Mississippi system, we saw flooding extending through the west, working its way east. Christmas Day, there was huge floods through Tennessee. And all of this is then draining into the Mississippi River. And we saw widespread, this is down in Mississippi. And to the degree that we were able to protect from this, it was because of levees. Right? Levees, of course, there's natural levees that form around any river that tend to keep it in its beds, but a natural river system also has a floodplain that it passes on over. Gradually in the United States over the 19th century, more and more levees had been dug or had been built around the river. There was a whole project, very large project with the Army Corps of Engineers trying to build up the levees. And we really depended on them for survival and the protection of our cities. When they started to fail, we needed to start raising them. And so there would be manning the levees, coming in and building up sandbags and building the levees taller to try and handle the surge of water coming through. That requires manpower, and in 1927, it's pretty backbreaking labor. They don't have a lot of mechanical sources for doing this. So this is the delta of the Mississippi. This is where the old cotton plantations were. It was still not that different from the societies that had happened when slavery was legal. This time they were sharecroppers instead of slaves. The way they got labor to defend the levees was to go to the plantation owners and get them to send all of their African-American workers over to build up the levees. When that wasn't enough, they went to the African-American parts of town and ordered the men at gunpoint out onto the levees to build it up. And when the levees started to fail, they kept the men there trying to protect against it. The final break, one of the many breaks, but this is the Mounds Landing break that ended up flooding most of the Mississippi Delta region. As the levees started to fail, they could feel it happening. The men tried to leave. White overseers with guns forced them back in. And several hundred men were swept away when the levee finally broke. But the Red Cross death toll listed it as 2. because they apparently didn't count the African American involved in it. Once the levee broke, it was then the remaining parts of the levee were the only high ground. So as the people ran away from the approaching flood, they ran to the levees. And what you ended up with was all of the people stranded up on the levees. In this area around the Mounds landing break, they begged for boats. For God's sake, send us boats, was a quote from one of them. That was actually a quote of a newspaper. When the boats finally arrived, only the white families were allowed to get on them, and the African Americans were left on the levees without water, without clean water, without food, without shelter. Eventually, we did end up creating refugee areas, but this is an interesting time in American history. Historically, we did not believe that government had any role in helping individuals recover from a disaster. And in fact, the Red Cross was the only entity that undertook to do these refugee camps. The problem, of course, we had over 1 million people that were flooded out across this flood. We had 650,000 people that were in refugee camps, and the scale of it was greater than anything that the Red Cross had dealt with. Calvin Coolidge strongly disagreed with any government involvement in what he would call regional affairs, but when this got so bad, he was forced to act. And the Secretary of Commerce at the time was Herbert Hoover. And he had a reputation for having really helped in the response to World War I. And he was handling the humanitarian crisis after the war. And so he was tapped for helping this. And he organized in an amazing way. He worked with the Red Cross. And he became lauded as the great humanitarian. He did a great job of pulling the country together and getting resources for people across, I think it was 10 different states that had refugee camps. Now, these refugee camps, however, were, of course, segregated. And the aid that came in was segregated so that better support could be given to the white refugees than to the colored, as they said. And there started to get word of just how bad the treatment was. People tried to leave, but the same thing of not letting them get on the boats, the farmers, the plantation owners were afraid that if their African American tenants left, they'd never come back. Probably true. So they tried to make sure that they couldn't leave. And so these camps were run with guns and guards, and they were forced to be staying there. There were a lot of abuses going on, and the word did start to get out. There's especially an African-American publication in Chicago, the Chicago Defender, that started documenting this and getting it out. There got to be more questions about it. So they turned to Robert Moton, who was the head of the Tuskegee Institute, and there was a colored commission that was formed to report on what was going on here. They came back with a report documenting many of these excesses and abuses, but basically said, but we'll work with you about what actually gets released. And what looks like happened is that Herbert Hoover made an agreement with them. Let's not talk about this, let's not really push this out. And because at this point, because he was being so successful, he was being considered for president. And he said, if I become president, I think of the unprecedented access that the colored community would have with the White House. And he talked about trying to change the sharecropping laws so that they could own land. And basically, they came to an agreement that they would not publicly publish this report, but instead work with Hoover to try and quietly solve some of the problems. Well, it worked, right? Herbert Hoover did become president, and the African-American vote was pretty significant because at that point, the African-American vote was essentially completely Republican. That was the party of Lincoln. They would never dream of voting for a Democrat, for a Dixiecrat. Right? So, of course, most of them couldn't vote in the general elections, but they did vote in the primaries. So the African-American support was very significant in getting Herbert Hoover the nomination. He eventually won, and he then completely reneged on all of his promises. And it so offended the African-American community. That's the beginning and of the end of African Americans in the party of Lincoln. And that when Roosevelt came up, the next election came along, over 30% of the African Americans, I think it was 40%, had voted for Roosevelt, which is the first time they'd ever seen more than 2 or 3% voting for the Democrat. And by 36, he had over 70% of the African American vote, and it's never gone back. Which is our other lesson. Disasters have really large political consequences in both directions, right? We saw both the Marquess de Pombal and Herbert Hoover getting success because of handling the disaster well, but then also the negative consequences of handling it badly. I spent a lot of time talking about pretty depressing stuff here, so I'm going to go and finish this with a more positive view by going back to Japan and our most recent disaster, which is the Tohoku earthquake in 2011 in northeastern Japan. This is the ultimate example of a cascading disaster. So the earthquake happened offshore of this is the island of Honshu. This is the island of Hokkaido that just had the earthquake a couple of days ago. That one, luckily, was probably over here where there are very limited, it's a sparsely populated rural area. And a 6.6 would be on a fault about 20 miles long, maybe 30. The magnitude 9 happened across all of northeastern Japan. The epicenter's here, but you can see in the red the whole area that was strongly shaken by that event. The event itself was handled really well. Japan probably has some of the best building codes in the world. Only about 150 people died in a magnitude 9. And the problem, of course, is that it created a tsunami. And it was a larger shift to the ground floor, the ocean floor, than we'd ever seen before, so that the tsunami was essentially 2 to 3 times bigger than they had thought possible. So a lot of the defenses and the seawalls were completely overwhelmed, and they ended up with about 18,000 people dying in the tsunami. There's a lot of training in Japan. The earthquake happened. People did head to high ground. Most of the people in the region did get out. Even in the worst hit areas, it's that same sort of 10% number that were actually trapped. I actually got to know some people there. Just to get an idea of what it's like. This one young man was working, actually I'll go back, up here in northern Japan. He lived in a little town called Otsuchi. He lived in the next town up, or he worked in the next town up. So when the earthquake happened at 2:40 in the afternoon, he was at work. He ran up the hill. The manufacturing plant he worked in was completely destroyed, and the road back to Otsuchi was destroyed. But he was okay. It turns out that his mother was taking her ill brother to a doctor's appointment when it happened, and it was in a tall medical building, and they took all of the patients up to the roof, and they all survived the tsunami because the tsunami washed through the lower 4 floors, but they were up above the 6th floor. Some hypothermia, but basically they all made it. His father disappeared. So his mother was taken to a refugee center. She saw neither her son or her father, or her husband. 3 days after the event, he finally realized that there was a way he could hike in through some back area because the roads were still out. He got in, found his mother, who collapsed on him. The father hadn't come. And he spent the next month going every day to the morgues to look at all the bodies that were found to try and identify his father. For a month, he opened body bag after body bag. And they eventually found his father in a debris filled in his car. They don't really know where he would have been going. He was identified solely by the watch that he was wearing. So For these communities along the coast, it was a horrific, completely changing experience, but these were small communities, 15,000, 20,000 people in these different towns. What, of course, made this a national disaster was the failure of the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant. And even there, the power plant handled the shaking just fine. What the problem was, you need to maintain cooling at all times in an active reactor, and they lost power. So they had a backup power system, and the backup power system did fine. But the backup fuel for the backup power system was stored at too low a level because they didn't expect the tsunami to get up to that height. So they lost the backup fuel. Once they lost the backup power, it overheated, it melted. They started getting radiation distributions. And that the red area is the distribution of the excess radiation. So people were evacuated originally within 2 kilometers of the plant on the day after the event, then 10 kilometers, then 20 kilometers, then 30 kilometers. And they all went to the city of Fukushima, which is up here. And so it's outside the worst area, but it's still the worst level of radiation outside of the evacuation zone. And another woman that I met there was a housewife getting ready for her daughter's graduation from preschool when the earthquake hit. And they didn't even know about the problems to the power plant until the refugees started showing up in their city, because they didn't have really any communications coming in. And the refugees were brought in, and they created temporary housing for them. And as they came in, every one of them had to be measured for exposure to radiation. So these people had run out of their houses, but just the clothes on their backs. And some of them had even the clothes on their backs taken away from them because there was too much radiation in the clothing. And for the next 5 years, they have lived in these temporary housing. The whole area around Fukushima is really too many people to be evacuating, but there continued to be more radiation. So one of the things they did, see this green plastic? They went through the city of Fukushima and scraped up the first few inches of topsoil over the whole city. Every playground, every schoolyard, every backyard, they scraped up the topsoil and put it into these areas and covered them up. And then what you see in front of them is the monitoring station, so you can watch what the radiation level is coming out of that and make sure that it stays safe. This woman is the one who had been a housewife. She is now the leader of a nonprofit helping people in Fukushima to cope with the radiation exposure, get protection for the children. She got this monitor their group got this monitor put up in place. They have monitors in the playgrounds so they can tell children whether it's okay to play. And then they've done education for the children to help them understand, why do you have to tell them to play on concrete instead of grass? It's because the cesium gets deposited in the grass and gets trapped, whereas from the concrete it gets swept up and gets out of the way. So again, the last lesson, what's really at stake is our communities. And what we need to be surviving is people who are committed, from the level of the Marquess de Pombal to the level of individual mothers, to protect the community that they left behind. And I'm going to wrap up this part of it with a quote from Maki, the woman I just showed you, and I always have trouble to say it without choking up, because I asked her, what did she want to tell the world out of this? And she said that she wanted to be able, in 20 years, to look back and know that they had done more than was needed to protect the children. Because to do otherwise, it would be so unbearable to look back and know they hadn't done enough. Right? So, on that really somehow depressing but also positive note that you can make the difference, what is it that you can do? And I am not going to give you the list of things that your CERT leaders can tell you, because you can go outside and get that. I want you to think about it in a different way, though. And remember that the risk from disasters is really about the risk to society. It is not about your individual life. That's what we think of because we're so afraid of that moment. But what really is at stake here is whether or not our societies survive. Societies have been lost. Pompeii was completely lost. Iceland came very close to being lost from a volcanic eruption that knocked out a quarter of their people. And they cannot be completely lost, but they can lose a lot. You know, the day before the 1906 earthquake in San Francisco was 5 times larger than Los Angeles. Los Angeles is now 5 times larger than San Francisco. And its biggest growth decade was the decade after 1906. People walked away and came south. And you could argue that San Francisco has never reclaimed what it lost, because it was the only economic powerhouse that mattered on the West Coast. And until Silicon Valley, it didn't matter a whole lot after 1906. So when you think about how do we do this, we need to think not about our individual lives, but about what matters to us in our communities. And I thought I would bring this up and say what matters in this community. Most Californians are pretty worried about earthquakes. I look at this and really wonder why you guys aren't more worried about floods. You know, there was a flood in 1861-62 that moved the mouth of the Santa Ana River by 6 miles because everywhere here was underwater. Orange County and much of Los Angeles County, the flats of LA, the LA basin, were underwater, and they were underwater for months. Right? We have had horrible floods in the past. We can in the future, and you really guys should be thinking about that. Not that earthquakes aren't a problem. Why do you think those mountains are there? In California, when you see mountains, think earthquakes. Something's pushing them up faster than erosion is bringing them down. But there are aspects that you get ready for disaster, you get ready for both of them. But prevention requires thinking about your individual risk and understanding it. And that preventing damage isn't just helping yourself, it's helping your whole community. You know, when a building is badly damaged, its neighbors get red tagged and you aren't allowed to use its neighbors because it might collapse on you. So it isn't individual financial decisions, it really is as a community. So when you are working on this, do it with your neighbors, because we need to do this together if we're going to have a society that functions. I can't do that alone, but if I'm working with my neighbors and I get together with the churches and with the schools and with the mosques and the synagogues, and we're all in there and connected, we start being able to do something together that means we have a society that can make it out the other side. Because in the end, with whatever does happen, we are all in this together. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll open up for a few question and answers from the audience. Sir.
Dr. Jones, could you spend a minute telling us about the difference between the San Andreas and the Newport Beach quake as it applies to Newport Beach area?
Okay. Here in Southern California, we are on a plate boundary, and the San Andreas system is the set of faults that accomplish the Pacific Ocean moving to the northwest. But it is a system, and there are multiple parallel faults. We have the San Andreas, the San Jacinto, the Elsinore, and the Newport Inglewood. So all of them are part of the same system. There are also a couple hundred other faults here in Southern California because we have a bend in the plate boundary and we have a lot of complicated things, the San Joaquin Fault and various other faults. In terms of risk, well, the risk, it's going to be the one that happens to go in your lifetime, right? And that's that random subset problem. But your chances of anyone going are going to depend on how fast the fault is moving. So on average, the San Andreas has a big earthquake once every 100 years on any one part of the fault. The Santa Sino Fault is maybe 1 to 200 years. The Elsinore Fault is maybe once every 500 years. And the Newport Inglewood is once every 1,000 years. So you're more likely to get a San Andreas. However, if you live here, the Newport Inglewood's going to be a lot worse because of that whole problem with the dying off with distance, and when you're right on top of it, it's a lot worse. We actually have some really cool new data that's come in about Newport Inglewood Fault at Seal Beach. People went in looking for tsunami deposits, couldn't find tsunami deposits, but they were able to see a feature that was created by the Newport Inglewood Fault moving and pulling things apart within there, and that's where we're getting, it looks like we have 3 earthquakes in the last 2,400 years, and bigger than the one in 1933. So it's a real risk when it happens. Less likely to happen, worse for you when you got it. All right. Disclaimer, I no longer work for the U.S. Geological Survey, so I'm not privy to what the various plans are. That said, I am still at Caltech, and so I'm at the edge of the development. We have, the software's there, it doesn't work perfectly, and that really upsets scientists, right? We really think perfection is really important, and you should never underestimate the ability of a scientist to put perfection in front of timeliness. So we've been running a pilot system for 6 years, and it's not perfect, much improved, right? We get warnings. When will it go public? Well, to make it really work, you need a lot of stations. So the Earthquake Early Warning System is basically the seismic network we already have that tells us when and where an earthquake happened. And if we can do it quickly enough, we can get you that information before the wave gets to you. You know, when I do this, you can't tell the time it takes for my wave to go out there, but it's about 2 miles a second, and if it's 100 miles away, we can get a lot of time. Southern California is the only part of the country that has enough seismic stations to be pretty reliable, partly because the mayor of Los Angeles used Homeland Security money to add over 100 stations to our system. So we actually, all of Southern California is in decent shape. According to the mayor, of course, who doesn't control this, it will be going public in Southern California in 2018. And which is partly him pressuring the USGS, but I think they're going to be going ahead and doing it. So I think there will be some public version very soon here. They are worried about the political consequences of doing it for here and not San Francisco. Mayor Garcetti goes, yeah, well, that's why we put up the money. Can we get something out of this? That's the intent. There is a working system. All right, there's a working system. How do we get it to you? The phone companies have been insisting that they can't, that it takes 10 seconds to go through their system. There's the WIA system, that takes like a minute. If you get an Amber Alert, that's a minute or two before it gets to your phone, which is useless for early warning. AT&T now says they can do it because so there's something being developed. That's one of the big issues. I think it's going to be available through the internet, so at least if you have your computer connected to the internet, you can get it pretty quickly. They also haven't spent the money they should have on developing a good interface and education. All of those are pieces that are complicated, but something's coming soon. Okay. Okay. I do not know the status of what's going on with the radioactive fuel, so that's a huge caveat. I also, all right, we don't have a subduction zone here. We have tsunamis that can come in from Alaska, which will have a couple hours warning. We do not have a local source to create a tsunami as we saw in Tohoku. I don't know the heights at which they are planning for there. I will tell you that when I was with the U.S. Geological Survey, we had first created this scenario of what a big earthquake would be, what we call the shakeout scenario. We also created a tsunami scenario. So we tried for 3 years to get the biggest tsunami we could into here, and we were really frustrated because we couldn't get we just couldn't get a very big tsunami in here. And it's, you know, it was an interesting thing that on the earthquake, it was like people were basically planning for the right thing. On the flood, they way underestimated what the real risk is, and on the tsunami, they overestimated what the risk is. So the biggest tsunami we were able to create requires putting a Tohoku-sized source in exactly the right part of the Alaska Trench to aim it at us. And that's a much bigger tsunami than we would get from anything like from the Pacific Northwest or any of the other sources. And that brings in about 2 meters to this region. It does cover Balboa Island. That's one of the few places that's completely inundated in a tsunami. 6 feet, something like this, above sea level. It will depend upon what the tide is at the time it's coming in. San Onofre, when we did the modeling, San Onofre was so far above the biggest one we could figure out how to bring in, we didn't include it in the model. So I can tell you on that particular event. Well, this guy's had his hand up the whole time.
Thank you. I want to ask this question to you for years. Based on predictive ability of your predictive model.
No, I'm a scientist. There's always more research to be done, because all scientists believe in that. In terms of the impact of the event, I actually believe that we have 95% plus of the damage understood. We know what the shaking distributions are. That's what seismologists have been doing for decades, is modeling how the waves transfer out. And I think we have a pretty good handle on that. I think we have a much better handle than we've had on what the engineering response is. That said, that engineering response is going to be pretty bad because most buildings were not built to the most current understanding. So we have built in a huge number of problems in our built environment and in our infrastructure. The modeling that we did for shakeout comes out saying that the business disruption cost from the disruption to utilities is equal to the total amount of direct damage in the event. It also predicts that a fire following earthquake is going to be a potentially catastrophic problem. It says if we get it during a big rainstorm, we're going to have landslides, major landslides, like something like we're seeing in Japan right now, but only if it's in a heavy rain time. And I think those sort of results are really quite reliable. Now, one of the things is our predictive power of our model about time is the model that it's random. And all of our testing of that model support that hypothesis. Any model that has tried to have a non-random component beyond what happens with aftershock triggering does not do as well as the random time model. Spatially predictable, temporally random. One more. That's detailed of the engineering here that I don't know. I've never looked at your engineering, your infrastructure issues in detail.
Are dams being maintained?
Have the dams been maintained? They've been maintained. Whether it's good enough, we'll find out in the earthquake. Should I keep on going, or you guys want out? All right, let's see. 3 more?
What about fracking? What's that going to do to the earthquake?
Okay, the question is, what does fracking do about earthquakes? So, fracking itself does not set off very many earthquakes. Petroleum extraction often involves producing a lot of wastewater. That wastewater is often disposed of by pumping it back into the ground. Pumping water into the ground sets off earthquakes. That is extremely clear-cut, and we've known it for decades. The biggest source of anthropogenic earthquakes in California is geothermal energy. The big geothermal plants up at Geyser and down by the Salton Sea both have substantial excess seismicity around them since they began production. we have, and of course, Oklahoma is seeing a huge increase of earthquakes because of the disposal of wastewater from their fracking procedures. For a couple of years there, they were having more earthquakes than California. They finally put some restrictions on how they do the pumping, and the rate of earthquakes is going down. Here in California, we have looked for a correlation between earthquakes and petroleum activity, and it is at best minor. It's not completely zero, but it's really small and nothing nearly as big as what goes on with the geothermal plants. Yes? Actually, I sort of cheated there. I was a physics major until my senior year, and I took my first geology class and fell in love and read the 900-page textbook in the first week. And so I wanted to switch to geophysics, but I had also, my grandparents had been missionaries in China, so I spent my junior year abroad in Taipei just because I wanted to go be in Taipei, and it had 16 quarter classes of Chinese. So when I wanted to switch from physics to geophysics, it was easier to take the Chinese degree because I couldn't get up all the geology I needed. And by taking the Chinese degree, I didn't have to take advanced electromagnetics. And I got to take structural geology instead. Yeah.
What's your ham radio call sign?
I don't have a ham radio.
You don't?
No, I'm too busy. Yeah,
I live on Double Island.
it's Kate Hutton.
You mentioned what would happen.
Well, all right, you're going to have amplified shaking and you're going to have liquefaction. Maybe, depends on how much liquefaction you get. If you look at what happened in Christchurch in New Zealand in 2011, that'll show you what liquefaction is. You can go on YouTube and look at some of those pictures. Actually, you want to answer that one, Bruce? You don't want to touch it. You've got one of the world's experts on this here. Okay.
In the Tehachapi, Andreas,
I'd like to know. That's one of our, that's one of those questions that probably needs more geologic time than we've seen. Mostly we think that the Garlock is actually offsetting the San Andreas, and that's why we have the bend in the San Andreas. And at this point, the bend has just offset the San Andreas by about 100 miles between, and so Garlock is somehow succeeding to keep on pushing it over, and it keeps on twisting. The San Jacinto Fault is maybe forming to cut off part of that bend. So we are getting, but actually on geologic time, those sort of things move back and forth, and what's been the San Andreas has actually moved at different times. What's now called the San Gabriel Fault at one point was probably the active plate boundary. So the faults move around over millions of years. I think let's wrap up now. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. As a reminder, we do have a book signing, and we also have our CERT volunteers in the courtyard. Thank you very much.